Welcome to the overview of the book of Amos. Amos is one of the minor prophets in the Old Testament. Again, it's good to remember the difficult task that the Old Testament prophets had in warning Israel of coming judgment due to their disobedience. Amos was called by God to warn Israel about the coming punishment God was going to bring on them because of their failure. Let's consider the prophet Amos. The book of Amos begins with the introduction to the prophet. The name Amos means load or burden. He certainly would have felt the burden of Israel's plight in their disobedience to God. You won't find any other mention of Amos in the scriptures than what is in these 9 short chapters. Amos was a contemporary of the northern prophet Hosea. He came to Israel from a small town called Tekoa in the southern state of Judah, situated about 10 miles south of Jerusalem. What's interesting is that God called him to prophesy against the northern state of Israel and not Judah. Amos was a shepherd by trade. Not only was he a shepherd, but we learned that he was a cattleman as well. That is, he was a livestock breeder. We see this in chapter 7 and verse 14. He also harvested sycamore figs. So Amos was a mixed farmer in that he raised livestock and he grew figs. I think it's interesting how God selects his prophets out of all walks of life. God called him from his secular job to be a prophet to Israel. Amos admits that he wasn't a professional or a full-time prophet. We see this in chapter 7 and verse 14 as well. His ministry covers less than 2 years, somewhere between 765 and 758 BC. King Uzziah and Judah and Jeroboam II in Israel were reigning at the time of his ministry. The first verse of the book tells us that an earthquake occurred 2 years following Amos's prophecy. So we believe that the date of Amos' ministry was around 760 BC. It's difficult to determine the exact length of time that Amos prophesied, but it was a short period of time that God used him to prophesy against Israel. When we look at Amos, we should see him as a layman that God uses as a prophet sent to Israel, which was for him a foreign country for a short period of time. Because of Amos' profession, he would have traveled around and gained some knowledge about the history of the surrounding nations, which will play a part in his prophesying against them in this book. He certainly knew the history of the divided kingdom, Judah and Israel, and he knew about God's covenant with Israel that he was accusing them of violating. So God chooses to use this common shepherd herdsman to be his mouthpiece to his erring people. I find it instructive on the type of people that God uses. Amos was not a religious leader or even an important figure in his culture. He was a common shepherd and a fruit farmer. You and I don't have to be considered important by world standards for God to use us in his mission. We just need to be available. The purpose of Amos was to warn Israel of God's coming judgment against them and their defeat by a foreign nation. This was just the opposite of what Israel thought. They thought they were untouchable because God loved them and would protect them from all of their enemies. Here's the basic outline of Amos. First, we have the introduction in chapter 1, verses 1 and 2. We're introduced to Amos in these verses, and a short purpose statement for the book is given. The Lord roars from Zion, signifying the coming judgment of Israel and the other nations. The second main section is prophecies against nations in chapter 1, verse 3 to chapter 6 and verse 14. First, we see prophecies against surrounding nations in chapter 1 all the way to chapter 2 and verse 5. This section contains prophecies against Damascus, which includes all of Syria, the Philistines, Tyre, Edom, Ammon, Moab, and Judah. Amos begins prophesying against nations distant from Israel, but continues his oracles until he reaches Israel. The second section is the prophecies against Israel in chapter 2, verse 6, all the way to chapter 6 and verse 14. Now, Israel is probably in full agreement about all the pronouncements of judgment on the nations just listed. But Amos finally gets to the nation of Israel. And I'm sure they were no fan of Amos when he announced judgment against them. This is the largest section of the book, and it contains a lesson from history, prophecy against the house of Jacob, exposure of sinful worship, warnings to the affluent who mistreat the poor. It includes a poem or a lament for fallen Israel and a call to seek God and not the things of this world. Amos issues several warnings. There's a warning concerning the day of the Lord. Amos was warning Israel that when Yahweh returns, he will judge all sin, including theirs. He warns Israel of their unacceptable worship. God didn't want their offerings when he didn't have their hearts of obedience. Amos warns them of their complacency and their pride. They thought their ease would continue without judgment. They were wrong. Pride will come before a fall. Amos finished this section with a paradox of warning. God was stirring up a nation against Israel. And the final section is the prophetic visions in chapter 7, verse 1, all the way to the end of the book. In this section, there are 5 different visions that Amos has over the course of his ministry that are recorded for us. The first 3 are found in chapter 7. In this section, there's the vision of the locust, the vision of fire, and the vision of a plumb line, all referring to coming judgment. Something to note is that Amos prays after each of these visions. His heart was to see Israel turn and be spared God's wrath. A 4th vision is found in chapter 8, verses 1 through 3, and the 5th vision is recorded in chapter 9, verse 1. Then Amos concludes this book with a future restoration of Israel in chapters 9, verse 11 to the end of the book. Particularly, there will be a restoration of the Davidic kingdom. We see this in verses 11 and 12. There will also be a restoration of the land. We see this in the final 3 verses of the book. God had previously promised that a descendant from David would sit on David's throne forever. He also promised that Israel would see full possession of the land that he had promised to give to them. Here are some things to be aware of and look for as you read the book. First, consider the truth that God cares about how we worship. We don't define or decide how we worship God. He's already defined it. A second consideration. Think about the faithfulness of God's servant Amos. He was a shepherd in another country, but when God called him to be a prophet to Israel, he obeyed. Do we obey when God calls us to a task? Even when it is difficult or we don't see how it makes sense. Third, consider the gracious heart of Amos as he prays for Israel following the vision of judgment. Are you moved by the reality of the world's condition without God's forgiveness? Do you pray? Fourth, Amos recognized God's sovereign control over the nations. He knew that if God acted a certain way with these foreign nations, he would be faithful to act the same way with Israel. God is faithful. He will faithfully act on everything he purposes. Do you see God's faithful, sovereign hand in your life? Finally, recognize that Israel and the other nations are accountable to a holy God. They were responsible for all of their sinful actions. We too are responsible for our actions and our sins. The wonderful news is that Jesus took the punishment for our sins, but we still need to go to God and confess and forsake sin when they happen. There are many practical truths that emerge from this book. I trust that you will be challenged and encouraged as you read Amos and see that God will judge, but he promises a future restoration.